You may have noticed that people often talk about life as if only one explanation can be true. Either you chose this life or it happened to you. Either you arrived with intention or you arrived by force. Either your suffering has meaning or it is proof that something went wrong. But the deeper you look at real human experience, the harder it becomes to keep forcing life into these narrow either or statements. A person can walk into a room willingly and still be overwhelmed by what waits inside it. A person can make a choice and still not control the terms that follow from that choice. That is not confusion. That is how reality often works when decision moves from the abstract into the lived. Choice does not erase impact, and impact does not erase choice. This matters because many people are trying to heal with a model that is too simple for what they actually carry. If they believe they chose this life, they may feel pressure to spiritualize every wound and call every violation a lesson before they have even admitted that it hurt. If they believe they were only thrown into life, they may lose contact with the part of themselves that is deeper than circumstance and stronger than biography. One belief can turn pain into denial. The other can turn pain into identity. You can see the problem by watching how people talk when they are under pressure. The ones leaning too hard into sacred choice often become unable to speak honestly about shock, fear, grief, or rage. The ones leaning too hard into powerlessness often become unable to imagine that anything in them exists prior to what happened. In both cases, something essential gets cut off. One side loses truth. The other side loses agency. The more mature view begins by noticing that choosing a life is not the same thing as pre-approving every moment inside it. There is a difference between consenting to enter a field and consenting to every force within that field. You may choose to incarnate into density without choosing every distortion that density contains. You may choose a path of development without choosing each wound through which that development unfolds. Once that is seen, a great deal of false guilt begins to fall away. That false guilt has quietly shaped many spiritual people. They hear that they chose this life, then conclude that they must have chosen every betrayal, every humiliation, every confusion, every unbearable season. Then, because that idea feels unbearable, they either numb themselves or start speaking in slogans. They stop listening to the body because the body is telling a more complicated truth than the mind wants to hold. The body says, I may be deeper than this pain, but I still experienced it as pain. That is where the teaching becomes practical instead of theoretical. Real growth requires enough honesty to admit when something felt like being thrown. Not symbolically thrown, not poetically thrown. Actually thrown into demands, timings, family systems, economic structures, losses, and internal states that you did not know how to manage when they arrived. If your spirituality cannot make room for that sentence, it is not yet strong enough to hold a real life. At the same time, there is another kind of distortion that appears when people only speak from the language of being thrown. Over time, the self begins to organize around reaction. You stop asking what in you is deeper than the event and start asking only how to survive the next wave. Life becomes a series of impacts with no interior authorship. And even when new freedom appears, it is difficult to feel it because the nervous system has learned to interpret existence through interruption rather than participation. This is why the contradiction has to be held instead of solved too quickly. To say you chose this life without honoring the experience of being thrown creates emotional dishonesty. To say you were thrown into life without honoring the deeper dimension of your participation creates spiritual amnesia. One shrinks the human truth, the other shrinks the soul truth. Maturity begins when both are allowed to speak in the same room. Once you start looking through that lens, many things in your life begin to rearrange. You may notice that your resentment toward life is often mixed with disappointment toward yourself for not having been stronger sooner. You may notice that your spiritual language sometimes becomes most polished in the very places where your direct feeling has gone silent. You may notice that some of your deepest confusion did not come from pain alone, but from trying to explain pain with a worldview that had no room for contradiction. These are not small realizations because they begin changing the relationship between truth and self-protection. A clearer mechanism starts to appear here. When a person cannot reconcile agency and impact, the mind usually chooses one side and builds an identity around it. If it chooses agency alone, the person becomes excessively responsible for everything and secretly ashamed of being hurt. If it chooses impact alone, the person becomes excessively defined by what happened and quietly forgets their capacity to participate in becoming. Both are attempts to create coherence, but both create coherence by leaving something real out. You can find this pattern in ordinary life, not only in spiritual language. A person may say, I chose this job, so I have no right to feel exhausted by it. Another may say, I never asked for any of this, so nothing about my life can truly belong to me. Both statements sound convincing for a moment because they reduce complexity. But reduction is not the same thing as wisdom. Sometimes what feels most clean is only what has removed the hardest truth. The harder truth is that your life can be yours and still wound you. Your path can be meaningful and still brutal in places. Your participation in existence does not make you invulnerable to the conditions of existence. In fact, one of the most important signs of growth is learning how to remain in contact with your deeper authorship without using that idea to abandon your human reality. That balance is not achieved by theory. It is practiced in moments when you stop lying about what something cost you and also stop lying about what still remains possible. This changes the way healing is understood. Healing is not merely deciding that everything happened for a reason. That can become a form of fast interpretation that protects the mind from grief. Healing is closer to becoming able to tell the whole truth without collapsing into either blame or abstraction. It is the ability to say, something in me is deeper than what happened, and what happened still mattered. When that sentence becomes real, you stop forcing yourself to choose between dignity and honesty. It also changes the way responsibility is understood. Responsibility does not begin at the moment of original injury. It begins at the moment of present relationship. You may not have chosen the event in the way your spiritual ego wants to claim, but you are still participating now in how the event is organized inside you, repeated inside you, defended inside you, or finally understood differently inside you. That is not a punishment. It is where power quietly returns. Many people are afraid of that kind of power because it does not flatter them. It does not let them be pure victims, and it does not let them be untouchable souls floating above consequence. It asks for something more honest. It asks them to become large enough to hold origin, impact, adaptation, and possibility all at once. That feels harder at first, but it becomes steadier over time because it is built on what is real instead of what is emotionally convenient. You may even begin to see that being thrown is not always the opposite of choosing. Sometimes it is what choosing feels like after it descends into time, embodiment, limitation, and forgetfulness. An intention held at a higher level can arrive below as pressure, interruption, disorientation, or collision, not because the intention was false, but because translation into lived reality is never neat. The soul may move toward a field that the human self will experience as impact before it experiences it as meaning. That does not mean every painful thing should be renamed as sacred design. It means the relationship between depth and experience is more layered than most people have been taught to expect. Some things need to be grieved before they are interpreted. Some things need to be named as violation before they can be placed in any wider frame. Some things may never become beautiful in the sentimental sense, yet still become usable in the formation of a stronger, clearer, more truthful self. The point is not to force reverence. The point is to stop forcing simplicity. And once simplicity is no longer being forced, another question begins to open beneath the first one. Not merely did you choose this life, and not merely were you thrown into it, but what kind of being are you becoming when you stop using one truth to cancel the other? That question reaches deeper than explanation. It begins to touch the kind of strength that does not come from certainty, but from your growing capacity to remain present where two realities meet and neither one can be dismissed. What makes this difficult to hold is that once you admit both truths, you lose the comfort of easy blame. You can no longer place your whole life in the hands of fate and say none of this belongs to you. You also can no longer place your whole life in the hands of a higher self and pretend nothing genuinely violent or disorienting ever happened. That middle space asks more from a person than certainty does. It asks them to become honest enough to feel what happened and steady enough not to disappear inside it. A lot of suffering stays locked in place because people are trying to interpret life before they've really described it. They move too quickly toward meaning because raw experience feels too exposed. They say this was all part of the plan, or none of this was their fault, and both statements can be used to avoid the harder work of direct contact. Direct contact sounds simpler than it is. It means letting reality be layered before you force it into a single conclusion. You can see this in the way memory behaves. When a painful event is remembered, the mind does not only remember what happened, it also remembers the explanation that was wrapped around it at the time. If the explanation was too small, the person keeps reliving the event through a frame that cannot hold it. So the body keeps sounding an alarm, not only because of the original pain, but because the meaning attached to it still feels false. This is why some people remain spiritually sincere and inwardly split at the same time. They may believe in purpose, growth, soul, destiny, or participation, but their nervous system is still carrying scenes that were never properly named. They have language for transcendence, but not enough language for impact. So, one part of them keeps speaking from a wide view while another part keeps waiting for someone to finally admit that what happened was too much. Until those two parts are allowed to meet, the person feels wise in theory and fractured in practice. There is also a social reason this contradiction gets mishandled. People are rewarded for clean narratives. If you say you chose this life, some will praise your spiritual maturity. If you say life happened to you, others will praise your emotional honesty. But fewer people know what to do with someone who says, I can feel a deeper participation in my existence, and still admit that some of what I lived through felt like impact, invasion, interruption, or shock. That answer is less marketable because it cannot be turned into a slogan, but it is closer to reality, and reality usually refuses to become neat just because neatness is easier to share. Once you understand that, another shift begins. You stop trying to solve the contradiction as if one side has to defeat the other. Instead, you begin asking what each side protects when it becomes absolute. The belief that you chose all of it often protects you from helplessness. The belief that you chose none of it often protects you from shame. Both protections make sense for a while, But over time, they also begin limiting what kind of truth you are willing to tolerate. That limitation shows up in everyday behavior more than people realize. Someone may stay in patterns that clearly wound them because admitting agency feels too dangerous after years of overwhelm. Another may take responsibility for everyone and everything because admitting that certain things were never theirs to carry feels like weakness. In both cases, the problem is not merely emotional, it is structural. The person's inner world has been organized around one sided interpretations that now shape perception, choice, and identity. This is why the contradiction is not only philosophical, it is functional. The explanation you live inside becomes the set of permissions you grant yourself. If you believe life only happened to you, you may quietly wait for rescue even while talking about healing. If you believe you chose every detail, you may quietly punish yourself for still being affected by what you lived through. One story leaves you stranded in passivity, the other leaves you stranded in invisible self-accusation. A clearer way forward begins when you separate origin from relationship. You do not have to know with certainty how every event entered your life in order to transform your relationship to what it became inside you. That question matters, but it is not the only question. Sometimes people obsess over cosmic authorship because it delays the more immediate work of present honesty. They keep asking why this was in the script while avoiding the fact that the current internal arrangement is still hurting them. This is where the teaching becomes more demanding. Your freedom may not begin at the point of original circumstance, but it does begin wherever awareness becomes honest. The moment you can say, "This affected me, this shaped me, this does not define the whole of me," something starts loosening. Not because you have explained the entire design of your life, but because you have stopped lying in both directions. You are no longer pretending total helplessness, and you are no longer pretending invulnerability disguised as spirituality. You may also notice that what felt like being thrown was sometimes intensified by timing. A human being can encounter a real lesson at the wrong developmental moment and experience it as pure disruption. Capacity matters, sequence matters, support matters. Two people can live through similar outer events and carry entirely different inner consequences because one had enough grounding to metabolize the experience and the other did not. That does not make one soul better than the other. It means embodiment has conditions, and those conditions affect how truth is lived. That recognition changes how compassion works. Compassion is not merely saying everything happens for a reason. Sometimes that phrase lands like distance, not care. Real compassion understands that meaning is not the first thing a person needs when they are still flooded by experience. Sometimes what is needed first is accurate naming, patient witnessing, and the restoration of enough safety for the deeper view to become usable instead of decorative. Meaning offered too soon can feel like pressure. Meaning that arrives after truth has been honored can become strength. This also changes how you look at your past self. You may have judged early versions of yourself for reacting badly, freezing, submitting, disassociating, people-pleasing, numbing out, or losing your sense of direction. But many of these reactions were not proof of failure. They were proof that life had exceeded the level of internal order available at the time. Once that is seen, the past stops appearing as a long chain of embarrassing weakness and starts appearing as a record of capacities that were overwhelmed, adapted, and are now being understood more clearly. That is not self-excusing. It is more accurate accounting. And once accounting becomes more accurate, responsibility becomes more intelligent. You stop taking responsibility for the existence of every wound and start taking responsibility for the ways you continue to organize around it. You ask where an old impact is hardened into a worldview. You ask where a survival strategy has become an identity. You ask where the feeling of being thrown has become the lens through which every new situation is interpreted before it has even had a chance to reveal itself. That is where many people quietly begin to recover authorship, not by denying that life hit them hard, but by noticing that the hit is no longer the only active force. There is now observation, interpretation, response, pattern interruption, and the gradual building of new forms of participation. This is what makes the contradiction livable. You are not required to choose between being a soul with depth and a human being who has been affected. You are being asked to become a person strong enough to let both truths inform each other. When both truths begin informing each other, even the question of choice becomes more refined. Choice stops sounding like total control and starts sounding more like deep agreement with a field whose full consequences could not be known from inside time. Being thrown stops sounding like pure accident and starts sounding more like the human experience of entering conditions that exceed immediate comprehension. The contradiction does not disappear, but it becomes more precise. It becomes less like confusion and more like a sign that reality is larger than the categories you first used to survive it. That is why this teaching cannot end at the point of comfort. Once you see that your life may contain both profound participation and undeniable impact, you begin having to ask more carefully where else you have been forcing single answers onto layered realities. You begin to notice how often the mind wants relief more than truth. And when that becomes visible, another threshold starts to come into view, because the question is no longer only whether you chose this life or were thrown into it, but what kind of perception becomes possible when you stop demanding that reality justify itself in only one voice. What becomes possible once this is seen is a different kind of maturity. You stop trying to build your identity out of one clean answer, and you begin building it out of your capacity to remain present inside layered truth. That changes the entire quality of your inner life. Instead of spending your energy defending a position, you start using your energy to increase contact with what is actually here. That shift may sound small, but it changes the way memory, choice, accountability, and healing all begin to organize themselves. One of the first things that changes is the way you interpret pain. Pain is no longer treated as automatic proof that something should never have happened, and it is no longer treated as automatic proof that everything was divinely justified. It becomes information about impact. It tells you where experience entered with more force than your structure could metabolize at the time. That does not answer every metaphysical question, but it gives you a far more useful starting point than denial or spiritual overreach ever could. This matters because many people have been trained to react to pain in only two directions. Either they collapse into it and let it become the total definition of their life, or they immediately rise above it in language and leave their actual human experience behind. Both responses interrupt honest integration. One turns pain into identity, the other turns transcendence into avoidance. In both cases, the person is no longer relating to pain clearly enough to understand what it did, what it shaped, and what it is still asking to be seen. Clear seeing begins when you admit that pain can be real without being final. Something can wound you deeply and still not contain the whole truth about your existence. Something can distort your development and still not possess the authority to define your meaning. This is where many people begin recovering their center. Not when they erase what happened, and not when they glorify it, but when they stop giving any single event the right to become the full narrator of who they are. That changes how responsibility feels in the body. Responsibility stops feeling like punishment and starts feeling like participation. You are no longer being told that you should have handled every moment better than you did. You are being invited to notice how your current consciousness now meets what earlier versions of you could not yet hold. That is a very different demand. One creates shame, the other creates depth. You may notice something important here. The more honestly you allow impact, the less dramatic you have to become about it. This seems backwards at first because people often assume that admitting pain will make them weaker or more consumed by it. But what usually intensifies pain is not the pain itself. It is the effort required to suppress it, justify it, reinterpret it too quickly, or keep it alive as proof that your life has been uniquely wronged. This is why people sometimes repeat the same emotional patterns long after the original circumstances have changed. The event may be over, but the internal logic built around it is still active. A person who once felt thrown may keep approaching every new opening as if it is another forced descent. A person who once clung to the idea of choice may keep explaining away every discomfort as necessary, even when their deeper knowing is asking them to interrupt something. Patterns survive through interpretation. What keeps repeating is often not the original event, but the unresolved way reality was organized around it. Once you understand that, you begin paying closer attention to the structure of your reactions. You start asking not only what you feel, but what worldview your feelings have been attached to. You notice where fear has been speaking the language of fate. You notice where shame has been speaking the language of spirituality. You notice where confusion has been disguised as certainty simply because certainty felt safer than remaining open. These observations are not abstract. They are the beginning of real freedom because they reveal where your suffering has been rehearsing itself through thought. This is where the contradiction begins doing its deepest work. It teaches you that truth is not always located in the elimination of tension. Sometimes truth is located in the capacity to let tensions reveal a larger frame. If you demand a single answer too quickly, you may gain temporary comfort, but you lose access to complexity. And complexity is often where the next level of honesty lives. Not complication for its own sake, but a wider reality that small categories were never built to hold. This wider reality also changes how you understand consent at the level of life. Many people hear the idea that you chose this life and immediately imagine a fully informed decision made from complete certainty. But a being entering embodied experience may not relate to choice the way the human mind imagines choice. It may be closer to resonance than contract, closer to alignment than prediction, closer to participation in a field of becoming than a detailed approval of every single condition that would later emerge. Once that possibility is allowed, the contradiction softens without collapsing. You no longer need choice to mean total foreknowledge in order for participation to remain meaningful. At the same time, you no longer need the feeling of being thrown to mean that life is meaningless, hostile, or devoid of deeper pattern. Being thrown may be the human sensation of entering density without full interpretive access. It may be what it feels like when consciousness meets conditions faster than the personality can make sense of them. That sensation is real. It deserves to be named accurately. But once it is named accurately, it stops pretending to be the only story available. You can feel the difference in lived experience. Before this shift, the person keeps swinging between resentment and self-blame. One day they feel victimized by existence. The next day they accuse themselves of having somehow asked for every wound they carry. Neither position brings peace because both positions are incomplete. But when layered truth is allowed, the system settles. There is more room to grieve honestly, more room to take responsibility intelligently, and more room to sense that meaning may be discovered through relationship rather than imposed through ideology. That is where healing becomes less performative and more exact. Exact healing does not rush toward forgiveness because forgiveness sounds evolved. It does not rush toward control because control sounds strong. It asks better questions. What actually entered me here? What conclusion did I build around it? How has that conclusion shaped the way I approach people, risk, love, power, intimacy, failure, and uncertainty? And what begins to change when that conclusion is no longer treated as sacred? These questions matter because the life you are living now is not only made of past events, it is also made of the meanings you continue to grant them in the present. That is why two people can survive similar things and move into radically different futures. Not because one was more spiritual, but because one began to examine the architecture built from the experience. They begin to see that a painful event had become a lens, then a rule, then an identity, then a prediction. And once that sequence becomes visible, it can be interrupted. The interruption is rarely dramatic at first. It often begins quietly. The person notices that they do not have to interpret every challenge as punishment. They notice that they do not have to justify every wound as spiritually necessary. They notice that they can hold reverence for life without becoming submissive to every form of suffering. They notice that they can honor mystery without abandoning discernment. These are subtle movements, but subtle movements are often where real transformation begins. This is also where compassion for others becomes more grounded. You stop forcing people into simplistic spiritual categories. You stop expecting immediate meaning from those who are still metabolizing impact. You stop confusing numbness with wisdom or eloquence with integration. You begin to understand that some people are not resisting truth because they are shallow. They are resisting it because truth arrived through conditions that injured trust, and now even helpful insight can feel threatening until enough stability has been restored. That understanding makes your presence less judgmental and more accurate. In time, this changes the way you stand inside your own story. You are no longer trying to prove that life was either entirely chosen or entirely imposed. You are learning how to remain available to what each layer reveals. The deeper layer may speak of resonance, pattern, and participation. The human layer may speak of shock, rupture, disorientation, and recovery. Wisdom does not silence one in favor of the other. Wisdom listens until both reveal more than they could have revealed alone. And that may be the deeper function of the contradiction itself. It may exist not to frustrate you, but to train you out of premature closure. It may be teaching you that reality cannot always be understood by forcing it into clean oppositions. Some truths are not waiting to be solved. They are waiting to be inhabited with enough honesty that a larger intelligence can begin to emerge through them. Once that is felt, even slightly, the question changes again, because you are no longer only asking whether you chose this life or were thrown into it, but what kind of being you become when you finally stop lying to yourself about how many layers your existence has already contained.
Mission resonated, the spiral continues. You did not arrive here by chance, and you do not leave unchanged. More teachings are unfolding across the Vaharat library, each one meeting you where you are, not where you think you should be. Follow resonance. The next threshold is already listening.